But Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. You know, I must be missing something. This statement really disappoints me. But from what I read from the experts, that's not the consensus reaction. Many commentators seem to want to give this poor behavior on the part of the patriarch a pass. They seem to even try and defend what I consider a cowardly act. How dare you say that he's a coward? Have you forgotten how he handled those 4 thug kings of the East? Look, some of the bravest warriors ever to walk the battlefield were pushovers in their own home. If the missus is on a rampage, sometimes it's best to just surrender, cut your losses, and retreat. That may be good advice, but that doesn't make it any less cowardly. I'm going to repeat what I said last time because I feel strongly about it. Throughout my studies, I've noticed that it's often very difficult to find frank assessments of God's varsity team. Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and all of the other big names of the Bible are rarely viewed by the scholars in an honest light. I think that's a mistake. The only human being that you can be certain is above criticism is Jesus. And I'm sure you knew that already. Certainly you knew that was my opinion. All others are mere humans who make mistakes. And I believe these mistakes made by Abram and Sarai are here in raw form because we need to learn 2 important lessons. Number 1, no one is above succumbing to human weakness. And number 2, we must clearly see the gap in worthiness between our Lord and everyone else. These poor examples serve as a highlight of the pure righteousness of our Savior. We can see through their imperfect lives as a direct contrast to his perfect one. No one can save us except Jesus. And we can see that through the mistakes all the rest of us, the mistakes even the best of us make. And Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand, do to her as it pleaseth thee. This just seems wrong on so many levels. Hagar was a human being, and Abram is treating her as nothing more than an object to use and discard. This is one of the reasons I'm convinced that Abram didn't think that the promised seed would go through Sarai's maid. I doubt that Abram had the future of his family in mind when he went into Hagar's tent. Something else drove him to her, and I think that's clear right here. If Abram cared for the child in Hagar's womb, the last thing he should have done is turn the mother over to an angry, jealous woman. If Abram thought this baby would be the fulfillment of God's promise, he would have taken every possible step to protect Hagar. Now, I do think later on, Abram changed his mind, but at this moment, he was willing to put the whole mess behind him, no matter what that meant. Look, I know this is probably making a few of you uncomfortable. This is a revered Bible figure, and it appears that I'm taking swipes at him. Well, I'm actually hoping this is stimulating in your mind a willingness to look at these biblical narratives in a realistic light. These are real stories, and we should treat them that way. Make these things real, not only in your head, but in your heart. But Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. That's not the way to treat a human being. She isn't just property to be cast off. She's actually Abram's concubine, his concubine wife, and she's pregnant. And yet Abram shows her no sympathy whatsoever, and that disappoints me. At the very least, Abram, have the guts to mediate a solution. Instead, he seems to just wash his hands of the whole thing. But Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. All Sarai needed was Abram's implied consent, and she dealt hardly with her. Now, what that means, we don't know. We don't have any of the details of this hard treatment. Did it get violent? Maybe. Corporal punishment was common in those days. Beatings and whippings weren't out of the question with unruly slaves. No matter the details, we learn that it was enough to drive a pregnant woman to take her chances with the harshness of the Middle Eastern desert rather than continue under the authority of her enraged mistress. And again, we have no record of Abram trying to stop her. She's carrying his baby, for crying out loud. Why would he risk the future of his people perishing in that inhospitable environment? I'll plant the seed in your mind again. I want you to ask this question. If Abram thought that his canoodling with Hagar was the start of the fulfillment of God's promises, why did he let her go? Well, to me, there are two possibilities. Number one, he didn't know she left, or he didn't care. He didn't care that she left. And if that's the case, then I don't see how you could come to any conclusion other than Abram didn't believe that the child she was carrying was the promised seed. Well, what do you think, John? I think Abram was a human, subject to all the frailties that all humans are subject to. And despite that, despite the frailties, but despite the failure, despite the cowardice, God continues to work with them. Listen, fewer lessons are more important to each of us personally than that. If Abram was used of God despite all of that, despite his faults, there's no reason to believe that our faults will disqualify us. Listen, God doesn't call the perfect because he doesn't want to work alone. But Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. Verse 7. And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way of Shur. Now, the Bible, as you probably know by now, is chock full of things people like to disagree about. This is one of those points of disagreement. For the first time in the Bible, we have the phrase, the angel of the Lord. In fact, this is the first time any angel is brought up. As you may imagine, the opinions as to who verse 7 is referring to varies. Some say this is nothing more than a man, perhaps a prophet, sent by God to deliver this message to Hagar. Some say it's an actual angel. After all, it says an angel. But I think a close examination of the context of this section reveals who this actually is. You know, sometimes when trying to figure out what something or someone is, the first step to determine that is to determine what they're not. When scanning this whole section, one has to come to the conclusion this is not a man nor an ordinary angel, as some say. And we can safely come to that conclusion by what this angel says and by what this angel knows. Let's read it again so we have the facts fresh in our minds. But Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand, do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. Verse 8, and he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence camest thou, and whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself unto her hands. Verse 10, and the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and thou shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. And he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. And she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou God seest me. For she said, Have I also here looked after him that seeth me? Now for starters, this angel claims to have the power to do something only God has the power to do. He said to Hagar that he was going to multiply her seed. In other words, he's going to give her a large family. I'll say it again. Only God has the authority and the ability to not only give life, but to concentrate it for his own purposes. God was going to increase that family of Hagar's, the family of that unborn child, into a great multitude. And this angel's going to do so for God's own purposes. Wait a minute. He didn't say he was going to do it for his own purposes. Yeah, true, but that's how it turned out, isn't it? This angel knew things only God could know. He knew where to find Hagar. He found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. He knew she was pregnant. He knew how that child would turn out. The angel of the Lord, it's actually the angel of Jehovah, and that's another thing. No created angel has ever been associated with the name Jehovah. Yes, but there have been prophets of Jehovah. True, but this doesn't say prophet of Jehovah. It says angel of Jehovah. There are some who try and say this is referring to a prophet sent by God to talk to Hagar, that God gave the message to some human and that this human prophet went to find Hagar. Utterly ludicrous. Let's just ignore that one. If God wanted to say prophet, he would have said it was a prophet. So let me say again, the angel of the Lord, the angel of Jehovah, knew Hagar's child would be a male child and that he would be a wild man. Now, I think the English robs us of some of the rich imagery here. The Hebrew word is pereh, and it's referring actually to a type of wild donkey. Most experts agree that what's being referenced here, that pereh, means an onager, which is an aggressive, fierce, untamable, desert-dwelling donkey. Some have therefore interpreted this verse as meaning wild ass man rather than just man. Why what than just wild man? Clearly what the angel of the Lord is saying is that Hagar's child and Hagar's child's family were going to be combative men, probably quite warlike. We know that they have become that. And then the angel says Hagar's son would dwell in the presence of his brethren, which probably means that he and all of Abram's other sons will be intermingling as neighbors. Some interpret this as meaning dwelling up against his brethren. In other words, always harassing and being harassed by the other sons of Abram. Either way, this is a prediction. This is a prophecy of a future state. So my point is that only God can provide prophecies of this clarity and certainty. So that leads us to really only one conclusion. This angel of the Lord, this angel of Jehovah is divine. He's God. Certainly Hagar thought she was talking to God. For proof, let's reread verse 13. And she called the name of the Lord, the word is Jehovah, that spake unto her, Thou God seest me, El Ra'i. That's what that means. In the Hebrew, it's El Ra'i. She uses God's name El and then combines it with the characteristic that most impressed her at that moment, the God that sees me, in the Hebrew, El Ra'i. She called the name of the Lord that spake to her, El Ra'i, the God that sees me. The name Hagar used to identify that angel she spoke to was a divine name. And she called the name of the Lord that spoke unto her, Thou God seest me, for she said, Have I also here looked after him that seeth me? He is the God that sees her. But most likely, this is God in the form of the Son. That's really our only option here. The context gives us the context that this gives us tells us this is a divine person. And the fact that this is not referred to as Jehovah, but rather the sent messenger of Jehovah, that's precisely what an angel is, a sent messenger. This sent messenger of the Lord, the sent messenger of Jehovah, is none other than the pre-incarnate Jesus. This is Jesus before he was born in the flesh. This is a Christophany. Most Christian scholars agree. Now, just about the only Old Testament scholars who do not agree are rabbinical or otherwise Jewish scholars, which makes sense. Jewish scholars have never recognized the divinity of Jesus, and therefore they would not place him here in a situation that clearly involves a divine person. Now, believe it or not, we're not done with this verse yet. There are a couple more things I want to talk about. We're currently working on verse 7, but let's read verses 6 and 7 together. 6 sets up 7. But Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. Now, oddly, we'll get to verse 7 in a second, but oddly, some scholars contend with the common interpretation of this verse, verse 6. They actually suggest that Sarai is being presented in an undeservingly harsh light, that we're interpreting Sarah's treatment of her erring servant wrong. We're told that the English word hardly is not the only possibility when translating from the original. Even Martin Luther suggests that the Hebrew allows us to construe Sarai's actions as nothing more than corrective. He says all she wanted to do was humble Hagar, presumably put the handmaid in situations that would remind her of her place. And the only reason she fled is because she didn't like that sort of treatment. It wasn't that Sarai was harsh. It just was Sarai's fault. Or Hagar's fault. It was Hagar's fault. It wasn't Sarai's fault. It was Hagar's fault. That's the notion. That's what Martin Luther is saying. As I said at the beginning of this section, we sinful mortals sometimes find it hard to believe that anyone in the Bible could be as bad as we are. As I said before, that's a mistake. Humans are humans, and we all very often act like humans. All right, I'm going to back up one verse, Genesis 16:5. And Sarai said unto Abram, my wrong be upon thee. I have given my, does this sound like a reasonable person? Sarai said unto Abram, my wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. Verse 6, but Abram said unto Sarai, behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain in the water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. Now, one of the many advantages of reading commentaries and other expert analysis, which I always recommend that you do, is that very often things you haven't noticed before will jump out at you. Here's a question I've never thought of until I read H.C. Leupold's commentary on this section. Why did the angel of the Lord seek Hagar out? As Leupold puts it, a singular honor is conferred upon Hagar by the appearance of the Lord, angel of the Lord. Why did he come after her? She's just a slave girl. We're not given any details that would lead us to believe that she's anything more than that. And yet the angel of the Lord, someone we've suggested is none other than the pre-incarnate Jesus, the Son of God, nonetheless, the angel of Jehovah went after her, found her, and then most extraordinarily spoke to her. Some have suggested that the reason this happened to her, the reason she received this singular honor, as Leupold put it, is because she was a godly woman, that she was an exceptionally pious member of the household, that she had, because of her demeanor and virtue, a special place in God's heart. Well, again, I think that's just pure speculation. Nothing in Scripture could lead us to that conclusion. Now, she may have been pious, but we have no evidence to support that. To consider her as such would be guesswork. So I personally reject this theory. Others have suggested that the angel of the Lord sought out Hagar in response to the prayers of her mistress Sarai and her husband Abram. That as soon as they noticed Hagar was missing, they got down on their knees and asked God to intervene. Now, once again, this is nothing but imputed piety. Those that hold to this view seem to want so badly to overlook Sarai and Abram's poor behavior, and more importantly, they want you to overlook their poor behavior, that they suggest the Lord wouldn't have acted to intervene in this dispute if it weren't for the prayers of those two super saints. And you know, there are some very prominent Christians who hold this view, very well-known, well-respected members of the Christian community who will tell you that this is the reason the angel of the Lord headed out to save and find this wayward slave girl, that he was only acting at the behest of Sarai and Abram. It's a lovely thought, but again, there's not the least bit of evidence to support that in this account. In fact, the context and the tone suggest the opposite. I mean, if we're going to speculate, I think a more supportable speculation would be the theory that Sarai and Abram were actually relieved that she had left. Her presence was creating quite a mess for those two, and her departure may have been welcome. Well, what about the baby? Weren't they hoping that Hagar was going to give birth to the promised seed? As I've been saying, I'm not so sure they did. I've argued that Abram didn't seem to take it too seriously. Once the deed was done, he didn't seem to care much about the mother. He didn't defend her from Sarai. Now, I admit it's tough to read into these things, and that's why we shouldn't. But if one is going to stick one's neck out, I'd say Abram's nonchalant attitude toward the question as to how to deal with the arrogant, disrespectful to her mistress Hagar was indifference and thoughtlessness. If Abram believed Hagar was carrying the one God had been promising, I think he would have behaved quite a bit differently. You would think Abram would have been more protective of the future of his race. But when Sarai sought his advice on what to do with the uppity Egyptian, Abram caved to Sarai's anger and threw Hagar under the ox cart, so to speak. All right, we're still working on answers to this question. Why did the angel of the Lord seek out Hagar? Join us next time as we continue to consider the possibilities. See you then.